Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm Don Shelley, your host, joined today by my co-host and co-founder of the podcast. That would be my daughter, Alexis Shelley. Alexis, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad. We are doing this recording remotely. We've done that a couple of times, so we're getting a little bit better at it. And we thought we would do something a little bit different on the podcast today. We just finished. This is actually episode 26 that we'll be posting, which means we have completed 25 episodes. So we probably will entitle this episode something along the lines of Thoughts at 25 or a quarter of a, I don't know what we'll entitle it. Although we do try to have clever titles. I don't know if we always succeed at that, but one of the things we might entitle it is sort of the state of the podcast. You and I both decided now would probably be a good time to maybe give folks a little bit more of a background on who we are. We know that information is found at the website, but not everybody has gone to visit the website. Also talk about sort of what the experience has been so far and some of the things that we see moving forward. So today will be a little bit of a departure. We'll keep it on the shorter side. Where we're not exactly talking about a what if in history, except I guess we could talk about the historical what if there hadn't been a fork in time.
Yeah, no fork. No fork.
No fork. No fork. Suddenly what popped into my head, and I tell people all the time, it's probably a good thing they don't understand how things work sometimes and how I free associate in my head, but the first thing that popped into my mind there was a reference to the popular movie The Matrix, where the famous line is, "There is no spoon." So I already know now what the title of this episode is going to be. What if there is no fork? And so we can pick it up from there. So I guess as a starting point, Alexis, we had talked about this for a number of years, and I actually did the introduction recording. I guess that was back in early May, and sort of informed you, oh, by the way, we're going to do this. Do you?
Yeah, I was at a wedding.
Yeah,
and you texted me.
Yeah, you and your mom, my wife, were at a wedding actually out of town when I had finished doing some work at home that weekend, and suddenly realized, hey, I've got a little bit of time here. The baseball game wasn't on yet. Started thinking about it. Said, you know what I'll do? I'll start researching where to host a podcast and some of the other things I'd looked at before, and then that led me to making the first recording, the introductory recording, and from there, things just sort of went on. I sort of felt like once I got that out there, I was committed to do it. So the important thing was committing to do it. Yeah. So that was back in early May of 2019. And as we're making this recording, we are in early October of 2019. So we're coming up easily on.
It's November now.
Thank you very much. See, this is why we don't let Don do the podcast by himself all the time, because he'll make stupid mistakes like that are just as simple as, are you looking at the calendar? So it means we're 6 months in. And so 6 months in, 25 episodes, seemed like a good time maybe to just sort of take stock on where we are. We're not looking to stop. I'm not looking to stop, but sort of understand where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. So that's what we're doing today, and we appreciate our listeners. And we say this all the time, we really do appreciate our listeners. The site that we host the podcast on actually has a metric and an algorithm that they use, that they update 4 times a day, and I've gotten better at not just going and checking it constantly. I will say that about myself over the last few months. But they have an estimate there of the total number of listeners that we have, sort of based upon how many downloads there are, how many of those are unique, how things are trending, and they warn you right up front that it's going to take a while before those numbers sort of settle in. So I remember when that number was 3, which I think was the first time that I actually saw it, and I knew that 2 of them were me, which is the scary part about that. And I've also seen the number get above 200, but just for the sake of our listeners, the number now seems to fluctuate based upon how the algorithm is doing the math, somewhere between about 160 and about 220 listeners, depending on what time of the week it is after the release of the podcast. So my best guess is now, based upon their math, not mine, but I don't have anything to really compare it to, is that we probably have around 200 people that listen to the podcast at least somewhat frequently. So I don't think I know 200 people who have enough interest in history or alternate history to be there. So I know that also means that we found some strangers, which hopefully we're making friends along the way. But again, we want to say thank you if you found us, and I hope that you continue to stick with us and also that you provide us feedback. So it's sort of along the lines of what we talked about we would do today, Alexis. The first thing I'm going to ask is, what has the experience been for you? And I'll ask you to focus on two things. What is about being a part of doing a podcast that is exactly what you thought it was going to be? And I guess the more important question, the more interesting question might be, what has surprised you?
I've definitely enjoyed this process. I find myself when I'm, doing chores or even sitting at work, just coming up with random thoughts and random things that I think would make a good podcast topic. I think what has surprised me is honestly how much I enjoy it. And I know that sounds really strange considering we're 6 months in and I have no thought of stopping, but I never thought I'd be able to come up with the enthusiasm for a topic. But I find myself, when it's been a few weeks since I've recorded, missing it, which is something that I think kind of surprised me. But I also think I definitely didn't expect the amount of background work that things take just to get prepared and to not kind of talk off the cuff. You have to do the research and you have to be dedicated to that. And of course, we've mentioned before, we both have jobs that this is not our main job. So having to kind of figure out when was going to be the time to do that, maybe I didn't quite expect how much background work that I would have to do. But again, I do find myself enjoying that background work, and I find myself trying to figure out ways to kind of fit it in and do it as much as possible. So that's kind of been my snapshot of what I didn't expect, but also kind of what I did.
Yeah, I think I would echo and share those sentiments and those thoughts. And I think you're exactly right. As I mentioned when I first started the podcast, in fact, if you go and listen to that little brief introduction, which is like 2 minutes, and it's probably the best 2 minutes we've done on the podcast because it was tight and clean and didn't wander and didn't chase off topic or follow a tangent. For example, just like the sentence that I just said, chased a tangent. But I think one of the things that I learned and discovered was that being an avid listener to podcasts over the last few years and enjoying it, particularly enjoying the podcast that I love. And I know you and I share some podcasts that we love, Alexis. We have different interests, so there's different podcasts that we don't share. But I think what I really quickly discovered is the folks that I listen to on other podcasts that I really enjoy, that are part of my sort of religious, regular podcast listening, and I rotate things in and out of that. But the people that are good at doing that are really good at doing that.
Yes. I want to introduce somebody that you've probably heard pitter-pattering on the back of the podcast. You just barked. That is my dog, Madison.
Yeah, I was about to say something since Madison chose to bark up, and I chose not to be in the isolated, if you will, nice, quiet sound room of the study upstairs as I was making the recording. So then again, we said this is sort of a look behind the scenes of A Fork in Time. So one of the things that sometimes tends to interrupt recordings if we're not careful is Alexis's dog, Madison, who lives with my wife and I here in Houston, even though Alexis lives in Galveston, just because it works out that way. So we currently have custody of the dog, and I think she realized that I'm talking to Alexis, which is part of the reason that she was barking, or someone is doing lawn work outside, or a combination of the two. So there you go, the behind-the-scenes look at what goes. If you're going to do a podcast your own and you want to sound as professional as possible, you probably need to have a dedicated space and have the ability to keep pets totally out of it. That's one of the other things that might be a good learning that we've come across here in the last few months. But back to the point that I was making is that what I really came to discover is that the folks that I listen to who are very good at doing podcasts are really good at it. It's not as easy as they make it sound. And it's one of the things we talked about, and I know you would share this, Alexis, we want the podcast to not sound overly produced. We want it to sound conversational. For those of you that are familiar with one of the more popular podcasts that exists in the podcasting world, that's the Stuff You Should Know podcast with Josh and Chuck. One of the things I've enjoyed about that podcast, which I think is now like in their 11th year, listening to an episode
Something
the other
like
day.
That, yeah.
They mentioned it. and it has evolved over time. And when they go back and play past episodes, what they call their select episodes, you'll see that. But one of the things that I've always enjoyed about that podcast is, while I know it's being produced and it's being done professionally. In fact, recently, I guess in the last year, they've become a part of the iHeart radio conglomeration of things. But it seems conversational. They don't always, for example, go out and edit their gaffes. And it really just feels like you're sitting in a room with two people you'd like to sit in a room and talk with or listen to, talk about things that are interesting to them that they may not have even known before they did the podcast were interesting to them. And so one of the things I really hope we would be better at doing, I think we've done it well on some episodes and not on others, is to have things not sound overly produced or overly professional. But even when they're just doing the normal banter and when they're just talking, they're good at that. You can tell they've been doing it for over a decade, and they make it seem much easier than it actually is. So one of the interesting findings for me is that if you have a podcast that you like and it sounds effortless, trust me, the person who's making it sound effortless is either incredibly talented, far more talented than I am, or they are just, or they have experience doing it. It's not as effortless as it sounds.
Correct. Absolutely.
So one of the things we wanted to do as we progressed forward was also sort of, I keep talking about this. I've said this I've said this a number of times. I wanted to build a community. And Alexis, do you really understand when I say I want to build a community, what I'm saying there? Maybe if I ask you that question, I can make sure that I'm also expressing it well to our listeners.
Absolutely. I think when we say we want to build a community, we want to talk to people that aren't just us. Well, my dad and I love talking about history and things like that. That's one of the reasons we started this podcast, because if we didn't have a podcast, we'd just be doing this regularly. We've been doing it for years. But we want to talk to people that aren't just us. We want to kind of diversify our interests and kind of learn from other people what they think is interesting and what their takes on things are in terms of this realm. So I think that's what we mean when we say build a community. We want to have a dialogue, a conversation with people, and determine what they think about these topics.
Yeah, I agree. And that's hard to do when the medium that you're doing it in is a one-way medium where you're talking and someone is downloading and listening. Obviously, it's not the same as it would be in a face-to-face conversation or even an online conversation, or it's not even what you would do necessarily. We have, by the way, first of many plugs you'll hear during this little time, we actually did set up a website. It's not anything special or fancy, but if you go to www.aforkintimepodcast.com, in the early days of the website, like in the first 3 to 4 episodes, I actually had built a forum there and sort of expected that what might eventually happen is that for every episode we would post a topic and people would go back and forth in the forum, and that may materialize at some point in the future. I guess with approximately 200 listeners and everybody being busy and the very nature of a podcast being something that you listen to perhaps while you're driving or while you're at work or while you're doing the dishes or whatever you do, that you do while you listen to a podcast, and we all do that. That's one of the cool things about podcasts is that's what they can be, is that you're not sitting there in front of the computer typing comments back like you would in a forum or in a chat room or any of the other ways that we interact, and it's certainly not a face-to-face conversational interaction. And so when we talk about that interaction, we understand it's a one-way transmission out from us most of the time, but we do value the feedback that comes back. And, one of the things we have seen a little bit more here lately, in fact, we were just talking about someone who gave us a lot of feedback just yesterday via the website, is what I do want to hear. If you think, you guys had a stupid take on that what if. We want to hear that.
Right.
If you guys think that we, did you actually think about this? Or, because you said this, you caused me to think about that. When I think community, it's just like you described, wanting to interact with others, but it's also wanting to hear back on ideas, because one of the things we've also talked about is both of us have a love for history, and sometimes we realize this as we go back and listen to some of the first 25 episodes. It's real easy for the podcast to turn into just a recitation of history. And that's not what the podcast is. It's necessary to do that. You'll hear me say all the time, it's necessary for us to actually look at the what did before we look at the what if, because those two things go together and you have to understand them. But it's real easy to slip into the let us just tell you about something that was interesting in history versus doing what we also enjoyed and what the podcast really about is let's talk about what if that had turned out differently.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you and I both have said it's really hard to do those single host episodes because you don't get that banter. You don't get that kind of conversation going. So that's kind of one of the things that, again, that's building community. That's, whether it's more guest hosts in the future or it's just people, commenting on social media, commenting on the website saying, what about this? Did you think about this? One of the things I'm remembering in my head is when we did the White Ship episode, I literally had the revelation about the Magna Carta mid-episode. That was not in my head 20 minutes in, and it just kind of percolated up. And it was what I kind of considered the bombshell of that entire episode. It was like, whoa, I didn't think about that. But through the conversation and kind of through talking it out, we came to that realization, and it was a big one.
Right, and I agree. We've had similar. We've talked about this off podcast. Again, that's our term, trademark, a fork in time. We've talked about that. We've all, each of us, both of us, have had that revelation sort of in the middle of recording a podcast, either with each other, or sometimes even in the middle of a solo. It's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Something I said just then sparked in my own head. And but I've also had that with the guest hosts that we've had on. We've had people that we know, or people that I know, more in some cases than the people although there is some overlap certainly in that, is that something that they would say, because it wasn't scripted, it wasn't talked about beforehand, suddenly sparked something to go off in me. I'm thinking in particular about one of my favorite episodes, which I'm sad that is one of the least listened to episodes that we have. That is episode 7. I am encouraging you, if you haven't listened to episode 7, go back and listen to episode 7. That was the first one where we brought in a guest host. That was Ryan Cole joining us for a discussion about, yes, it's a topic that I have passion about, which is baseball, but it's really the discussion was about baseball and integration. So it's talking about Americana and how baseball is a mirror or not a mirror of Americana, so to speak. And there were a number of times during that episode, that also being the first time that Ryan and I had talked about that subject, that in the middle of the episode, we chased rabbits, so to speak. I use the term all the time in some other teaching that I do. I'm going to chase a woodland creature here, please indulge me. But some of those woodland creatures were more interesting probably than staying on the main trail. And so, like you, I sometimes find it interesting and amazing that in the middle of something that you've actually spent work preparing on, you spend a lot of time thinking about, that all of a sudden when you're in the midst of doing it, it's like, aha, something pops into your head. And so I know exactly what you're talking about there. And I remember I was talking an off podcast after that was done about, hadn't thought about the whole issue of the Magna Carta, related to this in exactly that same way.
Right. And what the people also, I agree, episode 7 is great. What people also don't know is I literally thought Ryan and my dad were still recording because they were just upstairs talking for a good hour after they stopped recording because they were still chasing those rabbits. So yeah, Ryan is a fantastic asset. Hopefully he'll be on again sometime.
Yeah. And he does hold the distinction right now of being the only 2-time guest host. So I know that he'll be back on again because we've talked about other topics that he would like to talk about, and you've talked about some topics you'd like to talk about with him in episodes that the two of you may do together. But that's been the other thing that's been fun for me is I've known Ryan because of his father for most of his life, I guess, really. And he's now a as we talked about on the podcast, he's actually an adult and an accomplished adult. But that was the first time he and I had talked about those issues, and probably the first time he and I alone, just the two of us, had been talking for any extended period of time. And so it was sort of neat that happened, on mic, and then like you said, it happened. We probably talked for another hour and a half after that off mic, and that was quite a long episode actually when we did it. So that was also again one of the surprises that I found there. And also back to your point, I think one of the things that we talk about how the podcast is going to evolve. It's tougher to do because it involves connecting the schedules of more than one person, which is why it's not what has always happened in the past. But we know that the episodes are better when it's not a solo hosted episode. Regardless of who's doing that solo hosting, we know that we're better when it is more of a conversation and more of an interaction, because that's with the people that are on the episode, but also with the people that are listening can feel more engaged and more interactive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what else might have been a revelation or a surprise to you?
I actually was surprised. I know people in my life that love history, but I'll talk about this kind of side project that I'm working on. I'm working on this podcast, and I've actually been surprised the amount of people that are like, that's actually a really interesting Like the idea of counterfactuals, I think I thought it was a little bit more of a niche subject, but the amount of people that actually, when I kind of talk about what we're doing, I've been surprised at the amount of people who actually are interested in it. Actually, a couple weeks ago, you did a gaffe. You thought it was still October. I remember October very well because I was traveling the entire month for work. My joke was I didn't know what city I was in or what day it was because I was traveling so much. But actually, on one of the trips, I was not by myself. I had a coworker with me, and she actually asked. We actually listened to a couple of episodes of the podcast while we were driving because she just was interested in it. So I was surprised. I knew people that I knew the podcast would appeal to, but I've been surprised the amount of people who, once I explain kind of what we're doing and what the premise is, they're like, that actually sounds really interesting, and kind of finding people more organically that are interested in this topic.
Yeah, I agree, and it's I've had that with coworkers as well, and I happen to work for a company that has a global impact, so I've had that conversation with some of my global coworkers, and it's just been interesting to find out. Oh, yeah, people I didn't know had an interest in history that were in my life have mentioned things to me, and then I've had other people, actually comment to me about, particulars that about, oh, I really enjoyed that, I really enjoyed this, and yeah, I guess at some level, anybody who does something like this wants to do it for a little bit of the making, getting a little bit of people saying, hey, I enjoyed that. We all like to have, for lack of a better term, our ego stroked or feel good about what we're doing. But it's also interesting when I've had some of those conversations and people have, expressed something to me that was a surprise. Oh, I didn't know you thought that way, and that's okay. Again, that goes back to that community conversation that I was talking about in fostering a community. So.
Right.
So I totally get that. One of the things we wanted to do on this podcast was, again, say thank you. We wanted to give you a little bit of insider background. Some of the things that we're talking about doing in the future, we see ourselves probably not doing many multi-part episodes. I joked about the episodes that were about the Black Death. The Black Death killed about 60% of the inhabitants of Europe and almost killed a fledgling infant podcast because I think we did that too soon and perhaps with a topic that might not have been as much interest to other folks. But I do think we'll find ourselves we've talked about this, doing some more things that are thematic. So, Alexis, for example, what are some of the themes that we've talked about doing that would be over multiple episodes, independent episodes, but maybe tied together with a theme?
We've definitely talked about one of the things my dad, he mentioned the company he works for. It's actually a company related to the weather industry. So one of the themes we've talked about is different events that were impacted or were a direct result of weather situations, which I'm actually really excited about. Actually, I saw him a few days ago, and the first words out of my mouth is, I want to be on this episode, which is one of the ones we've been talking about kind of in that theme. We've also talked about different, and this was actually a listener suggestion, different things related to political campaigns. That again, those will be individual topics, but kind of in that overall branching umbrella term with political campaigns and political elections and things like that. So those are some of the themes that we're looking at in terms of, they're all going to be individual episodes, but they're going to kind of all be under this overarching theme.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I'm looking forward to doing on that is I've reached out to actually some experts in some of the fields that may be touched by that, because one of the things we'd like to do is bring in, historians and other people who have some real solid expertise, not just novice, amateur, armchair historians like we are, to bring in and have insight there, because I certainly think we would appreciate their insights. I think it's easier to do that, obviously, once the podcast is established and they can go back and listen to episodes and understand that, well, we may be quacks, but they understand at least we're persistent quacks that produce an episode every week and sort of get a sense for what's there, but to incorporate more of that. And again, that goes back to the thing we were talking about before. We know that the shows are better when they're not solo shows. And so one of our commitments moving forward is to do fewer and fewer solo episodes. That doesn't mean they won't exist, because I think there is a place for them. But I think the shows are better when, again, it ties that idea of community, and sometimes that community just begins with a couple of people that are involved in the show itself being able to play off each other, whether that's Alexis and myself or whether that's other people that may become part of the experience over time. So I think that's one of the things that you'll see moving forward. One of the other things that we really do want to see moving forward, I don't know how many times we've asked for this, Alexis, but I feel compelled to ask for it again, is really we need some more formal feedback. A lot of the feedback that we've talked about has been informal and it's been in other contexts, but we've set up a couple of different ways to actually get some formal feedback. And I think you agree with me on this. It would really be helpful if we had some formal feedback. So I know one of the things that we talked about there was our listener survey. Lex, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, we have a listener survey. You can literally find it from every page of our website. We tried to make it super, super easy. We host it through SurveyMonkey, so it's a simple 10-question survey that just gives us some general feedback in terms of topic ideas, in terms of how long you think a podcast episode should be. Really simple. It'll take you 5, maybe 10 minutes to complete, but we really would appreciate it because, yeah, it's fun to have a conversation with somebody about the podcast, but to actually see what people are thinking kind of in writing, it kind of codifies that, and it kind of really helps us determine what the look of this podcast is going forward. So please, we really encourage you. We made it super easy for you. Please just go take that survey. It would really help us.
Yeah, and I echo that. Also there on the website, which we try to keep pretty simple. I think it navigates pretty well. By the way, you can give us feedback on what you like or don't like about the website. That'd be another way that you can give feedback. There's multiple places to leave comments, both in terms of just regular feedback. So outside of a structured survey, free-form comments and feedback. That could be on a particular episode. That's sort of what I envision that being more than anything else. But it could be general feedback as well. For example, early on, in fact, it was before we had a website. It was by someone who responded by email. One of the first responders that we got from somebody like, I have no idea who this is, and they found us. But I appreciate their feedback. I hope they're still out there as a listener. Was they brought up very early about how easy it is for us to slip away from not covering the counterfactual, from not covering the what if. And I went back and listened to the episode they're referring to. I'm like, yeah, we did cover the what if, but that was a lot more history than what if history. And so, that's the type of feedback that we look for, and it keeps us honest and engaged and making sure that we're doing something that is meeting, the desires and needs of most of our audience. So, again, the listener survey is a great way to provide us structured feedback. And I would encourage anybody who listens to the podcast on a regular basis, please, I know it takes a little time to do that. You should even be able to do it from inside your phone. There, so you don't have to sit down on a computer to do it. But give us that feedback. It's a SurveyMonkey engine. It's 9 questions. You don't have, most of them are not free form at all, so you don't have to type in anything other than select a response, and that would be helpful. The other things that I would just mention there is topic suggestions. There is a place on the website to give us topic suggestions. We do give preference on topic suggestions to those who are Patreon supporters, and I will talk a little bit more about Patreon support here in a minute, sort of as we close things out. But history is big and history is broad, and I have a lot of ideas, and Alexis has a lot of ideas, but it's easy for us to get caught in the ruts of the type of history that we care about. This is not a complaint or anything regarding Alexis, but if everything else being equal, I know which genre of history she's going to go to. And there's nothing wrong with that. But one of the things we've been working on doing is keeping our time frames ancient, modern, medieval, and then also the subjects as varied as possible, because we know at the end of the day that's going to appeal to the largest listener base, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I do have my go-tos, but I want to, diversify that and things like that. And one of the things that'll help us with that is those topic suggestions and learning what our listeners are looking for.
Right. And again, I just reading through some topic suggestions that were received yesterday. They resulted a lot around presidential campaigns. And I actually have a degree in political science, so I didn't see or read anything there that wasn't outside the scope of what I could almost talk off the cuff about. But as I was reading some of those suggestions, I'm like, ooh, I'd like to do some more research on that. And so even if it's something that I probably would have already come to on my own or already be familiar with, the topic suggestions can sometimes lead me in different areas or thinking about it in a different way than I would have otherwise. So it has the benefit of adding diversity to the show, which I think is good, but it also has the benefit sometimes of, even inside of topics that we probably would have eventually hit, maybe a different spin or a different take on them. And so that's a valuable thing that goes on there. So I would encourage you to be part of that. One of the other things you could also really do for us that would be helpful, I've done some Google search optimization, that kind of thing. But I know that one of the ways that people have found us and will continue to find us is actually through searching on the various pod catcher or pod hosting sites. For most people, that's probably iTunes/Apple Podcasts. I never know what to call it now because they're sort of using both of those things out there in the world. There's Google Podcasts, but there's also places like Spotify and Stitcher and the other places that are sort of podcast aggregators. And through our podcast hosting service, we've made ourselves available on all of those. So most of those have some place to either go do a rating or do a comment or some combination of the two. And Alexis, I know you do social media and social marketing. How important is it for those things to exist, for example, outside of our website?
It is extremely important in terms of word of mouth, in terms of recognition. I cannot stress how important those things are. It's a form of organic discovery. So I cannot stress enough how much ratings, reviews, just mentions are important on platforms like that.
Yeah, and one of the things I would echo with that is that I find or search for new podcasts all the time, and when I find them on the podcatchers that I use, one of the things that I immediately look at is, does this have ratings? How many, it's the type of thing of saying is, before I invest some time in listening to this, has anybody else listened to this and do they think it's any good? And so it's very difficult for a new podcast that's not backed by spending lots of money to, I have the choice on Facebook, for example, on our Facebook page, just using that example. I could spend $15 and it tells me it would boost the podcast to over 2,000 people. I've never done that. Perhaps I should do that. Maybe I'd be amazed at what the response would be. But when we got into this, we said, our purpose was not to do this for commercial ends. And so the idea of me spending money to market something, I may do it and I'm not opposed to it, but that's not the way that I want the podcast to grow. I want the podcast to grow by people who have like interest finding it. But one of the ways to be found on the various sites is actually to be rated and reviewed, because that moves you up in the search engines when people happen to land upon the right combination. And history, alternate history, the types of things that we have that are keywords for the podcast, people do search for because they have found us. But once they find us, knowing that, hey, this is worth a listen, is helped by ratings and reviews.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I would just mention that is around that is if you do listen to it on a regular basis, and I think most people who listen to podcasts on a regular basis do subscribe to us. From what I understand, from people that have told me what sort of goes on behind the scenes, is even the podcast hosts and this ultimately the other things that are out there sort of doing those optimizations for searches, they sort of know the regularity with which podcasts are being downloaded. And that's a result of people subscribing to the podcast so that you don't have to go and look for it each time, but so that it's just there. It shows up in your podcatcher on your smartphone or however you do it. Actually, one of the cool things, Alexis and I were looking at this a couple of weeks ago, when you look at the site that hosts our podcast, is it will tell you sort of a breakdown of the devices that are being used to listen. And that's sort of an interesting thing to think about. For example, it will tell me that somebody is listening on their Apple Watch, not just listening on an iOS platform, but they're listening on their Apple Watch. So I imagine that person listening to the podcast maybe while they're walking or running or whatever they may be doing for exercise. But the other thing is actually it pops up the global perspective on who's listening from where, which I know is one of the cool things for me. Alexis, do you have any thoughts on when you look at the map, seeing where the listeners are coming from?
That is really cool to look at that map. Of course, we've mentioned before that some of our listeners are personal friends of us, people that we actually know, and we can generally pick on the map where they are. Typically, they're in America, most of the time in Texas. But then when you see the kind of random places that are popping up, and you're like, I know for a fact, I know nobody in that city or that country. It's really cool to see, and it's really impressive.
Yeah, I mentioned maybe it's approximately 200 listeners. I see Estonia pop up, and I see other parts of actually Australia and Oceania. And for the longest time, there was no listener in South America. Now there at least has been a couple of listeners in South America because the map says that there is. And just thinking that through, and I work for a global company in my personal life and my business life, and so I'm familiar with global commerce, and certainly the world's been made smaller because of things like the internet and communications. But the idea that that me sitting in Houston, Texas, talking about an American historical event from 150 years ago is even cared about by somebody in Russia. That's not trying to influence an election, for example. They care about it enough to listen to it. It's sort of interesting. It's sort of cool. Again, I don't do this for the endorphin rush that brings, but that brings a little bit of an endorphin rush and makes me wonder what they think. Which again, this now circles all the way back around to that feedback loop that's there as well. One of the other things that we're trying to get better at, we have promised our Patreon supporters that we'll put some exclusive content there, and we have in the past. We're still getting up to speed on that and doing that regularly. So if you're a Patreon supporter and you say, where's some of my exclusive content? We know that we owe you some things there, and we're trying to get better in the cycle of doing that. Believe it or not, there's a shared internet grid that Alexis and I look at regularly, and it indicates which types of releases they are and where they go and that sort of thing. So we're very cognizant of the fact that when there's a gap in that there's a gap. We see that every time we go and update that information. So we know we owe you that, and we're going to get better about that as we get into more of the cadence of the podcast. The other thing moving forward is we're working on building up our episode buffer. I guess we got up to maybe as many as 5 at one point, Alexis, that were in a buffer.
I think so, and I kind of didn't know what to do with myself.
Yeah. And the good news about that was it meant that if we each of us had a stressful week at work or our schedule was being crimped by other things, we're okay. We've got the podcast lined up. We know it's going to go and release on Thursdays. And by the way, Thursdays are the release date until you give us feedback and tell us a better date would work. But we need to get back into that. We've actually slimmed down our library, our buffer right now, so we know that comes and goes. And so as we build that up, that'll make it also causes us to think ahead a little bit more. So that if we want to align an episode with something that makes sense on the calendar, we're thinking about that, a couple of months ahead of time instead of a couple of days ahead of time, which is an important part of what we're doing there. So you're going to see us get better in that area. I am actually very proud of the fact that while we did in the normal stream of the podcast release some of the episodes that we had done it for exclusive content, we have not missed a week yet. Including this one, which is maybe cheating a little bit by recording something that's not directly on historical point for episode 26, but we have consistently released a podcast every week for 26 weeks. And I'm actually more proud of that than I thought that I would be. Talk about the things that I expected and didn't expect. That sounds like an easy thing to do until you're actually in the middle of doing it.
Yeah, especially when we have, real life commitments. Not that this isn't real life, but that impresses me too. That we've been able to keep that up. So we're gonna go forward. We're gonna go forward.
Yep, I agree. The last thing that I'll leave Alexis an opportunity here to say something else if she wants to. But the last thing that I wanted to talk about actually is you hear it a lot on podcasts. Go and be a supporter or a patron or and Patreon probably is the number one element that's out there for being able to provide financial support back to something that you listen to, particularly a podcast. So let me just talk a little bit about why that exists and what that's all about and what our expectations are and what our expectations aren't. One of the things that I want to say, and this is on one of the pages of the website where I talk about how you can support the podcast, is we did not do this to make money. If we did, we made an incredibly poor choice, or I should be spending money on a lot more of those Facebook ads. There's no doubt about that. But there are some costs associated with hosting a podcast. One of the things, we want to get us some new microphones that enable us to have better sound quality and learning more of the techniques that are there. And I'm getting better, I think, at doing audio mixing and the other things that are there, although those are areas that we can improve in. But one of the things is there is actually the cost of just actually hosting the podcast. You pay money to have it stored and hosted, and that's not a large sum of money, but it is a sum of money. So we started that out of pocket. I would continue to pay that out of pocket, but if I have the support of listeners who are enjoying that to help offset that cost, that's a much easier thing to do or a much easier thing to grow. Both in terms of the quality equipment and the hosting as well, and then some of the other things that we can do there. The other reason for support is it helps me sometimes, to be quite honest, prioritize time. If I know that part of what I'm doing is people are putting their hard-earned money out there because they want to see it and hear it every week. Not that I wouldn't have done it have done it anyway because of the commitment that I've made and wanting to do it. As we mentioned before, we both enjoy doing it. It also puts a little bit more of an obligation to make sure it gets done. That hasn't been a problem so far, but it's always a nice motivator to know that we're not letting somebody down, particularly someone who's a paying supporter. Having said all of that, if you continue to listen to the podcast, you never send a dime, you never make a comment, you never provide a rating or review, you never do anything, but you just continue to listen, that's reward enough for me. I think Alexis would agree with that.
Absolutely.
And so when you hear us on each podcast mention the Patreon page, it's not because we need that from you. It's not because we even necessarily want that from you if it's not something that you want to do, because as I mentioned on the website, and often there's all kinds of other ways that you can support and the podcast in terms of promoting it and the awareness bit of it. But it is there, and it is something that you can do, and we value that. Believe me, we value that because we understand that that's not – you have choices about your time. That's one of the most valuable things that you have, and you certainly have choices about your money. So when you hear us make those appeals or make those requests or make those suggestions or even just the mentions on the podcast, know where we're coming from. There are a number of podcasts that exist to support businesses. There's a lot of YouTube channels that are quite successful in terms of what they do in terms of generating money. I've read some of the things that are out there. That's not what we are. So I don't think that that's what we are. And again, our motives are to do something and share something that we enjoy. But if you want to be part of that, we want to give you a role to do that. But one of the other things about Patreon support, one of the things we have said there is that we will give preference on topics as we get more and more of those to those who are paying patrons. And to patrons who support at a higher level, it's not that you have to pay to be on the podcast, but we certainly will give more access to folks who would like to co-host or join the podcast who are participating that way, just as a way of being fair to them and giving them something extra for their support. So I just want to be very clear about what our Patreon link is about and what it's not about. Alexis, do you have any more thoughts to share on that?
Not really, just kind of echoing your sentiment that it is not a requirement by any means, but it is, if you are able to do it, we certainly do appreciate it. And yes, we do value the people who have already committed to giving us some of their well-earned dollars.
Yeah. And so we just want to be clear about that. We'll continue to be clear about it as we move forward. I have one other closing thought, Lex, but before I do that, anything else that we haven't talked about or hit upon that you'd like to mention?
I want to thank everybody for sticking with us for 6 months. I cannot believe it's been 6 months. It kind of has flown by. But I've really enjoyed these past 6 months, and so I'm looking forward to continuing, and I'm looking forward to hopefully connecting with our listeners in the future.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. The last thing I wanted to mention about promoting is social media. I haven't really mentioned that very well. Alexis can speak to this a lot more. It's what she does for her day job, or part of what she does for her day job. But we do have a Facebook page. I'm not as big on Twitter, but we do have a Twitter. What's the appropriate term there? Handle, I guess, or identity, or whatever you want to call it. Lex, help me here.
It's handle. You got it.
Okay. So a Twitter handle. We have the Facebook page, Twitter handle. We have Pinterest. So we do have a number of different ways. Those, again, also found on the website for how to do that. But sharing on Facebook is a fairly easy thing to do. And, while not everybody is involved in that aspect of social media, it's still pretty ubiquitous right now as we sit here in 2019. One of the things that we make a point of doing every week is on the website, we do post in our blog, which is sort of what's there on the first page, at least a note about the episode. And that's normally what I share back to the Facebook page, the show's page, but also back to my personal Facebook page. And so one of the ways that you can help promote the show is just by sharing that. That's a way to get some viral action going with respect to social media. Of course, Twitter would also do the same thing. And so I would Maddie endorses. You probably can hear her in the background. She definitely endorses. I think she's on something called Woofer, not Twitter, but she endorses that as well. But the point that I'm making is that there are ways that you can sort of spread the word that are very easy to do. They're as easy as a like or a share on some of those things and getting them out. And we know that will attract people back to the page, which connects them to the website, which connects them to being able to know how to download. So it all works together to do that. So, Alexis, do you have any more thoughts about how best to support on social media?
Yeah, really, I'll I follow our page obviously on Facebook, so I'll try and go share them as well. And then also I'll just share them on my personal Facebook page as well. So you can never negate the kind of grassroots of like a share begets a share begets a share begets a share, and that's just a way to get the word out. So I would really encourage, and I said a couple weeks ago on one of the solo episodes that I did, it was kind of my fall resolution. I was going to get more involved with social media, so that's going to be coming. I'm going to try and get more involved. October was a busy month for me, so, but I'm slowing down, believe it or not, now that we're hitting into the holiday season. So look for that as we come in the coming months.
Great. So again, we've actually gone longer. I see as I'm looking at my screen that we just rolled over the 45-minute mark of talking. So once the other production stuff goes in, this will be about a 50-minute episode or so. So this has actually gone longer than I expected. But I thought it was a good thing for us to do. 25 episodes seemed like a nice mark in time where we had enough sort of in the background to focus on, but also still obviously enough ahead to be thinking about as well. So the last thing I'll just mention is another way to reach out to us. You can actually just flat up send us an email. That's simple enough. That's at aforkintimepodcast@gmail.com. That was the first feedback channel that we had. It was the first feedback that we got because that was before building a website or Patreon page or doing anything else. And so that's always an option that exists there. And all these things can normally be found each week in the show notes. One other thing I just want to mention there in the show notes, I'm going to try to get better about actually, even if it's just to a Wikipedia page, of linking over to some things that'll give folks some of the things that we've looked at that are more the background on the actual historical event. That's one of the ways that we can avoid sliding into that trap of spending too much of the episode talking about the history, is to hit upon the history. And if you get really, really interested in the history of what we're talking about, the real world, the what did versus the what if, very quickly, very easily being able to have a link to get to that enables you to do that without us spending a lot of time on the episode doing it or spending more time on the episode doing it than we should.
Yes.
So I just want to mention that as we close. So unless Alexis has anything else to close out with, last time I'm going to give her a chance.
I just want to say, we've mentioned her before. She's made a couple appearances. Madison, she's actually named after Dolly Madison, so that's going to be another episode topic. We're probably going to do at some point some kind of what-ifs related to Dolly Madison, and she's approving, obviously, because I mentioned her name again.
Yep.
So.
She's getting the word out on Woofer that there's going to be an episode about her namesake, and actually, there's a couple of different things that are already in my head around that because one of them relates to the War of 1812 and the situation in Washington, D.C., and Dolly Madison's role in that. But then there's other things as well. But yeah, again, we just want to say thank you again for listening and hope that you continue to come back and hope that you continue to find it to be something that makes your week better, brighter, maybe causes you to think a little bit. I know some of the topics that we've had have caused me to think a little bit more about things that I thought I already had thoughts about that now I have different thoughts about. So that's not a bad thing at all. So again, on behalf of Alexis, this is Don saying that we appreciate you being part of the A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast family. And we really appreciate you giving us time today just to hear us ramble and talk about where we are, both as a podcast and where we're going to go. So without saying anything else, we're going to wish you a good day and suggest that if you encounter a fork in time, what should you do, Lex?
Take it.
Take it. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Join us next time.